In the traditional design, bid, build, project delivery method, the owner-contractor agreement is one of the most important pieces of the legal puzzle, and that's what this presentation is about. Now, it may be helpful to understand sort of the higher level context in which the A101 exists. The American Institute of Architects A series, of which the A101 is a part, basically is a whole collection of different owner-contractor agreement forms. And there are forms there for multiple project delivery methods, and within each project delivery method, whether design, bid, build, or design, build, or construction manager, what have you, there are different options within each method, and the A series has different forms depending on the different options that the parties choose to use within each project delivery method. So there are a whole bunch of these forms depending on which variation you're interested in. The A101 is the basic form where the project delivery method is design, bid, build. And then within that, it calls for a stipulated sum or a fixed price. This is where the contractor agrees to do the work for X amount of dollars. So it's a fixed price as opposed to, say, a cost plus arrangement where the contractor simply bills the owner its actual incurred cost plus a percentage that's agreed upon in the contract to account for overhead and profit. So this is not a cost plus contract form, this is a fixed price contract form. And one way to think about the A101 is that it provides what are essentially the commercial terms or the deal terms as opposed to the legal terms. Now, that's an oversimplified distinction because as contract terms, they're all legal terms at some level. But what the A101 does is set forth those terms that are typically negotiated between the owner and the contractor. And we're going to focus on some of the key commercial terms that one finds in the A101 to understand what typically gets a fair amount of negotiation. Then the legal terms are in a separate document, the A201, and we'll focus on those in a subsequent presentation. But the basic concept is that the A201 has a lot of terms and conditions that will apply across multiple pricing mechanisms and aren't necessarily going to change a huge amount from deal to deal. So while the A201 certainly gets negotiated, and sometimes very heavily, it doesn't have the commercial terms in the sense of price, schedule, etc. So the commercial terms of the AIA 101 that I want to talk about, there are just a few of them first. The first commercial term that we need to focus on is in Article 3, the date of commencement and substantial completion. And as you can see from the text that I've got in the slide here, that the concept is that the A101 says, okay, contractor, once we say go ahead and start the work, which is called a notice to proceed in AIA language, once you receive a notice to proceed, the clock starts running, and you've got X amount of days in order to achieve, quote, substantial completion. And if you don't achieve substantial completion in X amount of days, whatever that may be, whatever the schedule calls for, then you're liable to liquidated damages. Now, you'll remember from first year contracts, liquidated damages are damages that the parties agree on the front end in the negotiation of the contract to say that if there's a breach, then the breaching party will owe Y number of dollars to the aggrieved party. Well, in the context of a construction contract, the way that works is that typically the contractor will agree not happily necessarily, but they will agree that if they do not achieve substantial completion within the contract time, within the X number of days that the parties have negotiated and plugged into this A101, then the contractor will have to pay as liquidated damages Z number of dollars for each and every day that the contractor fails to achieve substantial completion. And this is designed to liquidate or determine in advance what the owner's damages are going to be for a late project, because the owner may have all sorts of costs that the owner is incurring, financing costs, lost revenue, etc., that may be difficult to calculate. The financing costs are probably not going to be difficult to calculate because they'll be whatever the additional interest is on a bank loan for the construction, for example. But the lost revenue, if we're talking about building an apartment complex and the owner's planning to have tenants in beginning November 1st and the project doesn't get completed until December 1st, well, the owner's got a month of revenue, lost rental revenue that has to be compensated for. And putting a price tag on that can sometimes be difficult because the market fluctuates for tenants and so forth. And so rather than haggle over what the owner's actual damages are, the parties will often agree to liquidated damages in the contract. And so that's what the reference to liquidated damages is here. But another point that's worth tying back to first-year contracts is the whole notion of substantial completion. You may recall that under the common law, the original rule was basically a contractor has to do 100% of the work before the owner is obligated to pay any money to the contractor under the contract. So under the traditional common law rule, if a contractor were to agree to build a $50 million skyscraper for the owner, the contractor would have to perform 100%, including every last doorknob and light fixture, etc., in that skyscraper before the owner was obligated to pay anything. And if the contractor didn't substantially complete, then the owner was still entitled to the building. And so that seemed unfair. And the way in legal terms we talk about that is that the owner's obligation to pay is conditioned on the contractor's complete performance. And if the contractor did not perform that condition of 100% performance, then in effect the contractor forfeited any right to payment by the owner. Well, that seemed like a pretty harsh rule, as I say. And so the doctrine of substantial performance developed as a way of avoiding forfeitures. And basically the doctrine of substantial performance was, well, if the contractor has substantially performed the contract, then the condition to the owner's obligation to pay will be deemed to have occurred, and the owner will have to pay the contract price less any damages that the owner can prove have flowed from the contractor's failure to fully perform. So in my skyscraper example, if the contractor had done everything except install a couple of doorknobs, well, that would certainly count as substantial completion. And substantial completion is defined elsewhere in the contract documents, and we'll get to that in a later session, but I just want to give you a refresher on the whole doctrine of substantial performance and how that translates into the context of a construction contract. If the contractor did everything except install a couple of doorknobs, then that would be substantial performance. That would be deemed to have satisfied the condition to the owner's obligation to pay. The owner's obligation to pay would therefore be triggered, and the owner would have to pay the contractor the contract price less whatever damages the owner incurred as a result of the contractor's breach in failing to install those two doorknobs. And that would simply be the cost of having somebody come in and install the doorknobs that the contractor failed to install. So not very much, probably. So that's even though this seems like a relatively straightforward provision, and it is, there's a lot of common law and common law doctrines that are sort of presupposed by this provision, and you find that a lot in the AIA documents or any construction kind of contract. Okay, another point to note about the commercial terms of the A101, as I said, this document is the one that's used when the parties have agreed that the contractor will perform for a fixed price, right? That's the concept here, that there is a specific contract sum, right? The contract sum shall be fill in the blank dollars. Okay, subject to additions and deductions as provided in the contract documents. What does that mean? Well, in every construction project, from a basic bathroom remodel to a petrochemical plant that costs billions of dollars, there are changes. And some changes increase the cost, some changes decrease the cost. So what the article or section 4.1 is getting at is, okay, contractor is going to build the project for X number of dollars, subject to modifications that the parties may agree to later that increase or decrease that contract price. And we'll get into how those are documented. They're called change orders in a later session. All right, now finally, one of the key concepts among the commercial terms of the A101 is this idea of progress payments. You see this in section 5.1.1. Owner shall make progress payments on account of the contract sum to the contractor as provided below. Now, you'll remember again from first year contracts and from what I said earlier that the default rule under the common law was that the contractor was entitled to no payments until the work was 100% complete. And so in my skyscraper example, even though the contractor is incurring all sorts of costs to hire subcontractors, et cetera, and do the work for a $50 million skyscraper, the contractor gets no money under the common law rule until it's substantially complete, right? The contractor at least gets the benefit of the doctrine of substantial performance. It says, okay, once the contractor is substantially performed, then the owner has to pay something. But the general common law rule was unless the contract is, quote, severable, where you can sever out one bit of performance to a corresponding amount of consideration, the rule is that the contract is entire, that is to say that the contractor has to perform all of the work before it's entitled to any payment. And so in order to change that rule, construction contracts, generally speak, like in my skyscraper example, that would be considered an entire contract, not a severable one. You've got one contract sum in exchange for one skyscraper, not the contract sum parceled out according to different bits of the project, usually. Okay, so to avoid any question about whether the contractor is entitled to payment as work progresses, the contract documents specifically say, okay, contractor gets progress payments, usually every month, and in a fixed price contract, they're usually based on a percentage of the work that's completed in the preceding month, and we'll talk later about exactly how that payment process works. But the key concept here is that the contractor gets paid along the way, usually on a monthly basis based on how much money how much work rather the contractor has performed in the preceding month. So it's important to get comfortable with the basic commercial terms of the A101. That document's not especially long, and it's a fairly quick read, but to understand how that allocates certain risks just at the front end. Certainly the risk that the contractor can't perform within a certain amount of time is on the contractor, because the contractor's agreed, okay, I have to achieve substantial performance within the contract time. The risk that the cost to the contractor performing the work might be higher than it's expecting is on the contractor. Why? Because the contractor has agreed to do the work for a flat fee, regardless of how much it costs the contractor to perform the work called for by the contract. On the other hand, at least the contractor has some consolation in knowing it's getting progress payments along the way, so it does not have to finance the project itself. It's getting paid as it performs work. That's not the only way of delivering a project, but in the design, bid, build contract or project delivery method, that's usually how things are set up.